Good morning. I am reading from the ninth book in the Left Behind series. The name of this book is Discretion. The Antichrist Takes the Throne. And today I am reading chapter 9. Buck focused on Chaim, framing him close to keep from giving clues to his whereabouts to anyone monitoring in New Babylon. If this worked the way Chang seemed to hope, the Global Community News Network people would try to pull Chaim off the air, and short of that, try to locate and reclaim the pirated camera. Buck turned the monitor so both he and Chang could keep track of Carpathia and also be able to tell when Chang switched to them. When GCNN moved to the camera inside the temple, they found a commotion. Nikolai barked at the volunteer cameraman's volunteer assistant, and the picture wobbled. Buck jammed on the headphones and heard the assistant. "I'm sorry, Excellency, but I don't want to do that." "You would disobey me?" Nikolai whispered. "I want to obey, sir, but—" "Sir, Holiness, but I'm not supposed to even be in here, and they aren't going to listen to me." "You are speaking for me, and if they are not out of here by the time I get to their stations, their blood will be used for their sacrifices." "Oh, sir, potent. Now, on your face, the same fate." GCNN in New Babylon broke in. "His Excellency's entourage has passed through the court of women, where Miss Viv Evans will wait. The rest have entered the court of men and apparently have come upon priests refusing to leave the temple for Pochnet Carpathia's private tour, as was clearly stipulated. From the time he negotiated with the Muslims to move the Dome of the Rock Mosque to New Babylon, the Potent made it clear that all activity in the rebuilt Jewish temple would be allowed only with his approval. It is no secret that Orthodox Jews have continued with the daily rituals and sacrifices of their own faith even after Enigma Babylon One World Faith was instituted as the only legal international religion, designed to incorporate the tenets of all faiths. After His Excellency resurrected himself from the dead, he became our object of worship, resulting in the dissolution of One World Faith and the establishing of Carpathianism. Still, the Jews and a fraction of fundamentalist Christians, known as Judahites, after their leader, self-proclaimed Messianic Jew, Dr. Tyson Ben Judah, remain the last holdouts against our true and living God. His Excellency will eventually enter the Holy of Holies, but first he is insisting on the removal of the descendants. Let's go back. Anyone not here in honor to me may be shot dead, Carpathia said. Are you armed and prepared? No, the assistant cried. I am armed, Walter Moon said. You, Nikolai said, pointing to the assistant, take Mr. Moon's weapon and do your duty. Buck was riveted to the monitor as Nikolai stared not into the lens but past it to the volunteer. The camera turned jerkily to show the man refusing the gun. There was a rustle, a shot, a cry, and the man fell. The camera turned back to show Carpathia himself with the gun. Show him, Nikolai said. And again, the camera moved toward the body on the floor. A change in ambient noise in Buck's headphones preceded Chang's voice. Here we go, he said. Chang stepped back into position, and the red light shone on Buck's camera. Not only does the evil ruler of the world want to rid the priests of their rightful place in their own temple, James said, but it also appears he has personally committed murder at the holy site. What Buck heard did not match the movements of James' mouth, and he realized the man was speaking in Hebrew, and he was hearing it in English. The protesting holy men watching the monitors outside shouted and pumped their fists, bringing others crowding up the steps. Many of these, Buck noticed, had no mark of loyalty either, and their number was growing. He peeked at the small monitor beneath his camera. GCNN was broadcasting Chaim, though through his headset he could hear chatter about technical difficulties. Chang broke in again, assuring Buck, I've got the New Babylon people muted off the air. but they're trying to get a bead on your camera. I'll switch back to Carpathia and let them wonder a while. Hold till Chaim finishes this thought, Buck said. As Carpathia continues, Chaim said, you should be able to see the laver when the priests wash their hands before they approach the main altar. The temple was creatively placed over a series of underground waterways where gravity allows constant water pressure for the various cleansings. Of course, he has no business in this place, and even a ceremonial wash of his hands will not exonerate him for defiling it. Switching, Chang said, and the monitor showed Carpathia signaling to his cameraman to follow. We were idle there for a moment, the man said. What did you miss? I don't think we picked up my touching the blood. No, Excellency. Shall we go back? No, Carpathia said, disgust in his voice. He held his black, red hands before the lens. My faithful get the message. He raised his voice till it echoed and was distorted. Anyone who dares interrupt my pilgrimage will find his blood on my fingers. Pounding footsteps made the cameraman whirl, and the screen filled with robed priests charging Carpathia. See where this blood comes from, Carpathia shouted, and the camera went to the faces of the priests who stopped and paled. Looking to where the body lay, they moaned and cried out. Does your evil know no bounds? Are you the God-hater, Nikolai raged, who do not know me as a God acknowledged by all others, but not named by you? One spoke up. It should not surprise you that we showed our loyalty by offering daily sacrifices on your behalf. You have many offerings, Carpathia said, but to another, even if it was for me. What good is it then for you to have not sacrificed to me? No sacrifice shall ever again be made in this temple except to me. Not for me, to me. Now leave or face the same fate as this unlucky one who was foolish enough not to believe that I have been allotted the nature of God. God will judge you, evil one. Give me your gun again, Supreme Commander. We retreat not in fear, but rather because you have turned the house of God into a killing field. Just go. I shall have my way in my home, and should you be found without proof of loyalty to me by week's end, you shall offer your heads as ransom. The priests left with shouts and threats, and Buck saw their colleagues outside greet them with sympathy and encouragement. Lovers of God, unite, one shouted, and onlookers picked up the chant. Buck's camera light went on, and Chain began again. The inner court inside the pillars has stairs that face east and lead to the main altar. Priests who rever God march around the court of priests and the holy place with their left hands closest to the altar. This one who would trample holy ground has already begun the opposite way, so his right hand will be closest to the altar. The scriptures foretold that he would have no regard for one true God. What plans he has for the beast with which he ridiculed the Via Dolorosa will be revealed only as he invades deeper into God's own territory. What a shameful contrast this is to the Shekinah glory of God, which has thrice appeared. The last time at this very temple, God appeared to Moses on Mount Sinai when the 10 Commandments were handed down. He appeared again when Moses dedicated the tent of God. And finally, he showed himself at the dedication of Solomon's temple on this very site. Should God choose, he could reveal himself even today and crush under his foot this evil enemy. But he has an eternal plan, and Antichrist is merely a bit player. Though Antichrist has been granted power to work his horror throughout the world for a time, he shall come to a bitter end that has already been decided. We were off the air again, Excellency, the cameraman reported when they came back on. What are you doing wrong? Nothing, Potentate. My red light merely goes off, and no matter what I do, it returns when it returns. Show that. Show the beauty of the construction. that was for my benefit, even though the architect and the craftsman did not know it at the time. The camera panned to the cypress, the cedar, the gold inlays and the coverings, the silver and the brass. No expense was spared in my house, Nikolai exulted. Leon Fortunato, apparently feeling left out, said something not picked up by the microphone. Speak up, my friend, Carpathia said, removing his lapel mic and holding it to Fortunato's mouth. You, my lord, Fortunato rasped, obviously weak and wasted, are the good spirit of the world and source of all good things. David Hasid sat high above Petra, with the solar panel of the laptop facing the sun and the screen shadowed. Chang was amazing, but the drama being played out on international television and over the internet made David wonder how Chang was going to gain the ability to free the believing Jews. He wished he could somehow communicate with Chang that the time was now to put out a call for everyone to flee before Carpathia finished the desecration and returned to retaliate. But scheming was not his place, David knew. God had this worked out since the beginning of time, and he alone can prompt change. The crowds outside the temple looked dangerous. Carpathia supporters tried to shout down the Orthodox Jews, but those who had received the mark and worshipped the image could barely stand. The growing opposition to Carpathia seemed to gain confidence with its numbers, especially considering that the Potent's inner circle and military personnel were so clearly incapacitated. Still, David knew Nikolai was a mortal incendiary, flaunting his temporary power. He instructed his Erat's camera bearer to set up behind him as he waited outside the veil, hiding the holies of holy. David could only imagine the God of heaven watching with the rest of the world, as with a flourish, Nikolai removed a long knife from his belt and sliced the veil from as high as he could reach all the way to the floor, then pushed back each side. Over Carpathia's shoulder, already awaiting near the brass altar, David could see Carpathia's own gaudy throne and the gigantic pig from the day before. Now, without a saddle and clearly no longer tranquilized, it fought two ropes around its neck, held by more Carpathia loyalists who not yet received his mark. Fortunato and Moon shuffled into position behind the pig, as if only to be sure to be in the picture. Suddenly, the feed switched to the camera outside, and David knew Chang had to have tipped off Buck. He had turned his lens on the opposite, watching the monitors. Many fell to their knees and tore their robes. The scene switched back inside, where the pig squealed and strained, and Carpathia laughed, approaching with the knife. He lunged at the animal, and it dodged, making him slip. Want to play? Nikolai roared, and leaped aboard, knocking the pig to its knees. It quickly righted itself, and the potent nearly slid off. He caught himself on one of the ropes, pulled himself back up, and reached with the knife, slashing the animal's throat. The pig went wild and dumped Carpathia to the floor. The animal thrashed as Carpathia struggled to his feet, his clothes covered in blood. The handlers held on, and the pig soon slowed and lost its footing. Nikolai, abandoning any semblance of ritual, resheathed his knife and cupped both hands under the blood pouring from the dying pig's neck. Before he was even upright again, he flung blood toward the altar and splattered the pig handlers, who ducked and howled in hysterics. Fortunato and Moon were caught in the melee and appeared to force smiles, though they also looked as if they were about to collapse. David sat with his mouth open, wondering how anyone could take seriously a man who not only thumbed his nose at God, but also acted like a drunken reveler at a frat party. When the pig finally stopped moving, Nikolai attempted to butcher it with the knife and found neither himself nor the blade equal to the task. Pity, he cried to the laughter of his people, and plopped himself down in his throne. I wanted roast pork. Carpathia seemed to quickly tire of the silliness. Get the pig out of here, he said, and bring in my image. He stood and hurried to a spigot of rushing water. The camera stayed on his face, but it was clear he disrobed under the spray. Cold, he shouted, finally reaching for a towel provided by yet another lackey. Someone handed him the robe, sash, and sandals from the day before, and he looked directly into the lens. Now, once my image is in place, he said, we are out to Solomon's scaffold. Chang patched in Chang patched in chain. Is this not the most vile man who ever lived? Rosenzweig said. Is he not the antithesis of whom he claims to be? I call on all who have resisted or delayed in accepting his mark and plead with you to refuse it. Avoid the sentence of grievous sores and certain death. David shifted and stretched his legs, either to interact with someone about what everyone had seen. The most logical person he could think of was Hannah. Buck feared his appropriated TV camera would be revealed when the small contingent of Orthodox Jews who had unintentionally worked together to shield it from Carpathia and his minions suddenly bolted away. The Temple Mount had become a roiling stew of angry citizens, and not just those without the mark of the beast. Loyalists had apparently come to the end of their patience with the loathsome sores all over their body, and the fiasco Carpathia had just perpetrated in the temple could not have amused more than his basest, most supporters, most rapid supporters. Masonic believers, new Christ followers, the Orthodox Jews, and seemingly even thousands of undecided among the general populace had seen the new Carpathia. It was as if he had abandoned any attempt to persuade or convince anyone. He was to be revered and worshipped and followed because he was God, and anyone who didn't agree would suffer. But those who agreed most heartedly were suffering the most. But to have murdered a man in cold blood on international television, to literally drench his hands with a man's blood, to have announced the end of ceremonial sacrifices except to himself, and then to not just claim the temple as his own house, but to also defile it in such a graphic, disgusting way, was more than the natural mind could comprehend. Men in flowing beards cried out. He would sacrifice a pig in the Holy of Holies and cavort in its blood. They fell to their knees, weeping and moaning. But even more people crowded the pillars at the top of the steps, calling for Carpathia's own blood. It became clear to Buck when Carpathia finally irrevocably tipped the scale against himself. The holy men shushed the crowd when Nikolai's small contingent of healthy men fetched the golden statue. A low rumble of dissent grew as thousands seemed unable to control themselves while trying to hear what dastardly thing he would do next. Why worship at an altar of brass, he said, his sneer filling the monitors. If this is indeed the holiest of holy places, every supplicant should enjoy the privilege of bowing to my image, which our most high reverend Father has imbued with the power to speak when I am not present. Carpathia waited inside the temple for delivery of a statue, but when the assignees appeared to carefully tip it horizontally and bear it inside, they were surrounded by the mob. Even GC personnel are fighting this, Chaim, Buck said, and the old man nodded. Buck shot him a double take. Chaim seemed more than solemn. He appeared distracted, probably running over in his mind his next step. This situation had turned uglier than anyone in the tribulation force had expected. From what Buck remembered of all these discussions and planning sessions, something had to give, and soon. When the protesters rushed the men carrying the statue, other loyalists from inside rushed out. brandishing weapons. A few fired into the air and the crowd backed off, waving their fists and cursing. When the monitor showed the men transporting the life-size image to the west end of the temple and up the steps to the Holy of Holies, the crowd had enough and began rioting. If a person wore a GC uniform and was not part of the melee, he or she was a target of it. Most uniformed personnel were too weak even to fire their weapons, but when some did and a few fell under their bullets, the throng erupted and attacked. The medical tents toppled, benches and chairs were upended, the guillotine was knocked over and stomped into pieces. Morale monitors and peacekeepers were trampled, their weapons yanked from their hands, and soon the TV monitors came crashing down. All over the Temple Mount, people raged, screeching, "Down with Carpathia, death to the monster, may he die and stay dead." Buck pulled Chaim to a safe spot and tried to shield the contraband camera. His monitor showed that the cacophony had reached Carpathia, and he appeared pale and shaken. "I am coming out to calm my people," he said into the lens. "They need only to be reminded that I am their risen Lord and God." Few heard that over the din, but those who did must have spread the word quickly, because as Buck followed Carpathia's march back to the entrance of the temple, he looked up to see the Orthodox Jews leading the way to the fake Solomon's scaffold, which was quickly reduced to splinters. A band of zealots spotted Buck's camera, and before he could convince them he was on their side, they grabbed it and smashed it to the ground. Desperate to see what would happen in front of the temple, Buck scampered up a tree and saw Viv Evans meet Carpathia near the entrance. Something kept the rioters outside, and Buck guessed it could be only their reluctance to assassinate a man in the temple, despite what he had done there. Nikolai looked petrified while trying to appear otherwise, and kept looking back to find the rest of his entourage. They finally caught up, but simply remaining upright seemed to take the last vestiges of strength from Fortunato and Moon and many others. Carpathia pointed and shouted, and someone found him a microphone that was connected to loudspeakers in the outer court. Like a madman choosing the wholly wrong approach to winning back the crowd, Carpathia held the mic in one hand and raised his other for attention, crying out, "You have breached the covenant. My pledge of 7 years of peace for Israel is rescinded. Now you must allow me and my..." But the rest were drowned out by the mutinous multitude. While they could not cross the threshold of the temple, they pressed right up to it, creating a human barrier between Carpathia and his freedom to step out. Suddenly they quieted and began to chuckle, then laugh, then roar with pleasure at what they had accomplished. It was as if they had cornered a helpless pest and now didn't know what to do with him. "My brothers and sisters of the global community," Carpathia began again, "I will see that you are healed of your sores, and you will again see that it is I who love you and bring you peace. You'll not leave here alive. Pretender," someone shouted, and others took up the cause. Then, crystal clear in the early afternoon air, came the piercing voice of the little man in the brown robe, and all eyes and ears turned toward him. "It is not the due time for the man of sin to face judgment, though it is clear he has been revealed." The crowd murmured, not wanting to be dissuaded from killing Carpathia. Chaim strode slowly toward the bulk of the group, and they respectfully, silently parted, as foretold centuries ago. Chaim continued as he angled toward the temple steps. "God has chosen to allow this evil for a time, and impotent as this enemy of your souls may be today, much more evil will be perpetrated upon you under his hand. When he once again gains advantage, he will retaliate against his presumption on his authority, and you would do well to not be here when his anger is poured out." "That is right," Carpathia hollered, his voice sounding tiny compared to Chaim's authoritative tone. "You will rue the day when you dared." You, Chaim roared, pointing at Nikolai, you shall let God's chosen ones depart before his curse is lifted, lest you face a worse plague in this place. Buck, still wedged in the tree, phoned Chang. Camera's trashed, he said. So I gathered. You getting this? The GC's trying to talk over it. It's as if they can't decide whether Carpathia would want it on the air. Heads are going to roll. What did Carpathia just say? Buck said. I missed it. Something about his being at the keenest, available to negotiate or to answer honest inquiries from his subjects. They'll never let him get out of the... But they did. The crowd backed away from Nikolai and his people as they head for Chang. Any chance of tapping into the Kensett? Buck said. Not that I know of, Chang said. Are you going? If Chang goes, I go. Leave your phone open. I'll patch it to everybody else. But before Buck could get down from the tree, Chang raised his arms and gained the attention of the angry mob. Let those who are in Judah flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house. And let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. Why should we flee? Someone yelled. We have exposed the potent as an impotent pretender. Because God has spoken. Now we're to believe you are God? The great I am has told me. Whatsoever he even thinks comes to pass, and as he purposes, so shall it stand. Buck was sure the people would have none of it, but Chaim had apparently spoken with such authority that they were instantly calmed. Where shall we go? Someone asked. If you are a believer in Jesus Christ as Messiah, Chaim said, leave now for Petra by way of Misbe Ramon. If you have transportation, take as many with you as you can. Volunteers from around the globe are also here to transport you. And from Misbe Ramon, you will be helicoptered into the Petra. The weak, the elderly, the infirm, find your way to the Mount of Olives, and you will be flown in from there. And if we do not believe, if you have an ear to hear, make your way to Masada, where you will be free to worship God as you once did here at his temple. There I will present the case for Jesus as Messiah. Do not wait. Do not hesitate. Go now, everyone. Buck was stunned to see many with Carpathia's mark stagger into the throng that was quickly forming to depart the Temple Mount. He knew they could not change their minds, that they had once and for all turned their backs on God, but they were now in no man's land. They were without the protection of God, and yet they had publicly crossed Antichrist. Should the plague of boils be lifted, surely GC forces would cut them down. The Orthodox Jews and the undecided were allowed at Masada, but no one who had taken the mark of the beast could enter. David had been unable to raise Hannah on his computer, so he wrote his response to her email and transmitted it just before watching the goings-on at the Temple Mount. Excitement coursed through him as he anticipated the first arrivals. He had spent hours setting up the basic framework of the wireless computer system, and now all he could do was wait. Buck didn't want to lose Chaim, but he needn't have worried. The Temple Mount was soon empty and left a mess. Chaim descended the temple steps and motioned to Buck to follow. As they walked in the direction of the Kensett, Jerusalem seemed to explode around them. Looters smashed windows and knocked over merchandise, kiosks in the streets. Drunken revelers sang and danced and sloshed drinks as they converted outside bars and clubs. Those suffering with boils wailed, and many tried to kill themselves in the broad daylight. Meanwhile, the Jewish believers, the undecideds, and the Orthodox Jews hurried along, seeking rides to the Mount of Olives, Masada, or Misbe Ramon. Operation Eagle vehicles abounded, unidentified other than by eager drivers encouraging others with the mark of God on their foreheads to quickly get aboard. Drivers who saw Buck and Chaim either saluted or pointed to heaven. Everywhere people called out, "He is risen." and were answered by Christ is risen indeed. Many were singing. Buck suffered from sensory overload. He mourned Hattie. He missed Chloe and Kenny and feared for their safety. He was both horrified and thrilled by what he had seen, and he was also puzzled yet hopeful. He had not expected change to have to persuade people to flee Carpathia while they believed they had already gained the upper hand, and of course he had no idea what to expect at Kensett. As a commercial pilot, Rayford had thrived on the schedule, the predictability of his days, but on this mission he had had to adapt at a moment's notice. Depending upon how God led Chaim, this could have been as simple as driving people from Jerusalem to Misbe Ramon, roughly 100 miles, then airlifting them about 50 miles southeast to Petra. But somewhere along the line, both Masada and the Mount of Olives had been added to the itinerary, and it was Rayford's job to stretch his personnel to fit the task. One responsibility he carved out for himself was picking up Chain and Buck once everyone else was safe. Dr. Rosenzweig insisted on their being among the last to arrive at Petra, akin to a captain and his first mates being the last ones of a ship, but Rayford wouldn't know until the last minute where to pick them up. Binoculars, he said. I can do you one better than that. Chloe, you looking up or out? Mostly out, Chloe said, yawning. Nothing specific. She didn't want Zeke to know what was on her mind. It wasn't that she didn't trust him. She simply didn't want any input. The adults had sat watching the temple debacle, and the flight to Petra was underway. Once she was satisfied that Buck was safe, she would be able to sit idle no more. Zeke had come up with an interesting idea weeks before. Like everyone else, she liked the way he thought, though his way of expressing himself might fool a stranger into thinking he was less than bright. He had encouraged Chloe to clone herself via the internet. You know, recruit other people like you. There have to be lots of young moms who are feeling left out of the action. Teach them what you do. Get them to do it in their areas and regions. You can't do it all yourself anyway. The concept had ignited like a gas-lit fire. Chloe uploaded manuals and lists of duties, procedures, cross-reference contact databases, everything a regional director of the International Commodity Co-op would need. She was virtually working herself out of a job. Now she had gone to the jack of all trades, and the one man beside her father, who had inventoried the entire Strong building. Zeke had gone further than Rayford, however. He had computerized a list of everything he had found. A tower that huge bore a motherload of treasures. I mean, there are binocs, he said. Some really super powerful top of the line types, too. But knowing you, you want the most powerful eyes I can find you. Am I right? As usual. It'll be dawn soon. You want it like right now? If possible. Be right back. Zeke took several minutes. His computer told him where this item was, and he headed for the elevators. Ming headed back to bed while Tyson reported that Chang had informed him he would try to patch Chicago to the Kensett meeting of Chaim and Buck with Carpathia. I need to sleep, Tyson told Chloe, but I will keep an ear open for that, unless you want to. I've had enough of St. Nick for one night, she said. Why don't you just record it and get some rest? Tyson nodded with a look that said her idea had a score with him. That way I can listen if I want and not worry if I nod off. Zeke returned, looking as if he couldn't wait to see Chloe's reaction. He handed her a plain white box that surprised her with its weight. She sat and opened it, producing a huge squatty telescope about a foot long that took 2 hands to pull from the wrapping. Wow, she said. Will this need a tripod? Not supposed to, Zeke said, but you got to brace it on something. The window ledge will do. Want any help? No thanks, Z. I appreciate it. Let me figure it out for myself. It's way past your bedtime, too, isn't it? Way past. And that's the end of chapter 9. Next, I'll be reading chapter 10. Thank you for joining me and have a wonderful day.